Roger Penrose, the mathematician and physicist from Oxford, actually calculated the probability of the universe arriving at its current low-entropy initial state.
The real statistical likelihood of our universe existing is 1 in 1. We necessarily observe a life-sustaining universe, because if we didn't live in a life-sustaining universe, we would not be there to observe it.
But a state calibrated to permit life points towards something.
No, it doesn't. Number big is not evidence for God.
The materialist story has primitive people inventing God because they were scared of thunder, but the archaeological record has them building religious sites before they figured out bread.
I don't even understand how those things correlate. There was thunder before there was bread, I'm pretty sure. Hello lovely people, my name is Emma. Welcome back to my channel, and welcome if you are new. Today we're going to look at a video that was recommended to me. This is on a YouTube channel called Moroni Standard. This is a member of the Church of the Latter-day Saints, a Mormon, who has written a video, and maybe he wrote it. The description cites a lot of sources, so he probably scripted this. But what I meant to say was he made a video titled Atheism Has a History Problem. And I just had a little look through the intro on my own to see if this was going to be, you know, worth our time. And I thought I'd check it out because A, seems like a nice guy. B, he claims to have been an atheist and has converted, or been converted. I have a lot of feelings about how Mormons convert people. And also it kind of seems like the title might be misleading, and it might be nothing to do with history and more to do with materialism, which is also nothing to do with atheism specifically. I thought this was probably worth diving into. Let's see what this chap has to say. I hope he says his name so I can refer to him more politely.
I used to be an atheist, not a casual one either. I grew up in circumstances where skepticism felt like the only rational response to the world around me. With a family that couch surfed, a father who couldn't hold a job for sometimes more than a couple of months, and a backdrop of abuse.
Massive red flag off the bat. First of all, very sorry he experienced that, and I don't want to criticize him too harshly for this because he's basing it off his own bad experiences, but the idea, this Christian, very Christian idea that you are an atheist, you choose to be an atheist, you become an atheist because you are a victim of negative circumstance and because therefore, you know, like, you don't have a nice life, so that's why you hate God or whatever. Hate that. Big red flag right at the start. Talking about the poor circumstances of your upbringing as, like, an explanation for your atheism. How many people have grown up religious and suffered religious abuse, emotional abuse, physical abuse as a result? It doesn't speak to the value of the mindset. Folks, is it just me? Or is everything shit lately? Feels like even more than usual, everything is shit. I bring this up because A, it's true, and B, today's video is sponsored by a mental health app, and I would love for you to listen to me explain it because I think it is a genuinely helpful tool. Last week we saw a guy explain that the military draft and cleaning toilets with a toothbrush was the answer to anxiety disorders. And I hate to be the one to tell you this, but that is not true. Therapy is great. Therapy is very helpful. But depending on where you are and who you are, it can be difficult to access. Sometimes you've done therapy, and you just don't want to do it again. I did cognitive behavioural therapy twice. The first time, it changed my whole dang life. The second time, it was not very helpful. Having really good mental health resources, especially all contained in an app, is great because you can do it alongside therapy, or while you're waiting, or as just a top-up whenever you need it. First, the thing that makes the B-Mailer app different: friends. Tag yourself? I'm Egg. The app is the resource. The app has all the tools. The plushie is like a little friend to go through it with you. There's actually some exercises on the app that involve you holding the plushie. And normally how it works is you buy a plushie and then you get lifetime access to the app. The app is light, dare I say, fun. For me, starting to write things down and log how I'm feeling is like a mind-blowingly simple but really effective tool for me. So you get that in the app with your daily wellness activities. There are free sessions with actual psychologists. There's a whole pile of calming tools and resources. There are programs that go at your pace and meet you exactly where you are. Plus you join a community of people who feel the same way and want to grow together. It's not therapy, and it's not pretending to be therapy. That's one of the main things I like about this app. It's a collection of tools and resources that you can use however you need, be that alongside therapy or not. You can download it today on the App Store and Google Play, and it's free for the first 5,000 users for the rest of their lives. That won't last long, so check it out now, grab your free spot. Even if you're only mildly curious, I say it's worth doing. Having these tools at your fingertips is always going to be useful, and just think, if you get it for free now, and then you really need it in a few months' time, it's like a little gift to your future self.
Going into adulthood, God simply wasn't a concept that fit the circumstances of where I came from. I couldn't see God's hand in my life, so God just didn't make sense for a kid like me. But Richard Dawkins did, Sam Harris did, and Hitchens did, So I read them seriously, applied their standards, and began to build a worldview around the idea that religion was what happened when people stopped asking hard questions. And that paradigm held together for a long time.
Okay, fair. Sounds like we had a fairly similar start to life as skeptics, which is really interesting because here I am and there he is on a channel dedicated to the Mormon Church.
Well, this episode today is for the people who are now where I was. For the street atheist who really thinks that they're the one following the evidence. For the ex-Mormon who left the church and decided the rational upgrade was philosophical materialism. Or the position that matter and energy operating under natural laws being the complete and sufficient explanation for anything and everything that exists.
Did that last part make sense as a sentence? I feel like it didn't. I feel like grammatically that fell off. I was waiting for the end of that.
And for the person who thinks that the burden of proof is entirely on the religious side of the table.
The burden of proof is always on the person making the claim. Extraordinary claim requires extraordinary evidence. Atheism does not make a claim. Religion makes claims. The argument that being non-religious requires, has a burden of proof, that's wrong. That straight off the bat, that is wrong. It sounds like, just early guess, it sounds like this guy might be really easily swayed by whatever text he is presented. He read Dawkins and was like, this guy sounds so smart, he's so right. He read Sam Harris, this guy sounds so smart, and then he read whatever Mormon authors and was like, oh my god, these guys sound so smart, they must be right. I wonder if we could convert him to something else if we tried really hard.
What I want to do is to show you what happens when you actually apply the same evidentiary standard that you use on religious claims to the materialist framework itself. Not to scripture and not to the ancient world, but to the actual physics, the actual archaeology, and the actual philosophy of mind. What I found personally when I did that was I found that the framework doesn't really hold up under its own rules. For example, philosophical materialism is not the rational default that it presents itself as. But it is, when you apply the extraordinary evidence standard, honestly, actually the least defensible position on the table.
So this whole video is a God of the Gaps situation. That's what this whole thing is going to be. It's going to be freaking, we don't actually know the answers to this, that, and the other. We don't know about, we don't have definitive answers to the origin of life, the universe, and everything. Excluding 42, obviously. Therefore, God makes the most sense. That's totally what it's going to be. It's all going to be God of the Gaps. Oh, I hope I haven't wasted our time horrendously here. At least he seems quite polite. I still don't know his name, though. Let me quickly check his channel. Maybe his channel says... Oh, Alex. I'm Alex Arnold.
I'm going to show you that today using secular scholars, secular mathematics, and secular history. I'm Alex Arnold, and this is Moroni's Standard.
I'm so sorry, he did introduce himself. He just waited till a few minutes in.
So what exactly is the claim atheism is making, and why does it have a burden of proof?
I'm so thrilled you asked, Alex. None. Atheism is not making any claims. Atheism is atheism. It is simply the lack of belief, faith in any deity. I'm aware that there are a lot of religious beliefs out there. I don't follow any of them. I am an atheist. Most non-religious people, I believe, however they might choose to identify, would technically fall under the category of agnostic atheist, like I do. I hear a lot of people say things like, well, I wouldn't be an atheist because I don't claim to know. Although if you were doing just a burden of proof, pure evidence, here's everything we know about the universe, here's everything we understand about how life works, there's a significant enough lack of God, there's a significant enough zero proof of God that I think it would be fair for some people to say they know that there is no God. But technically, because that's not possible, we're all agnostic atheists. So thanks for asking, Alex. I'm glad we can put this point to bed and move on, right?
Let's be precise about what we're arguing against, because the word atheism gets misused in two very different ways.
Oh, it so does. And I'm so glad that you've acknowledged that, Alex. Thank you.
One version is agnosticism in disguise. That would be the genuinely humble position of someone who isn't convinced either way. That's a totally defensible position, and we're not really going to be touching on that.
Fantastic. Thank you, Alex. Agnostic atheism, which I have just explained, is actually, in my view, most atheism. If you want to identify differently, I don't care. It's just terminology. There's no point arguing about, the minutiae of how we choose to use words, and if people use words slightly differently because of their experience or background or whatever, who cares about that? But thank you for saying that the mainstream, normal, atheist, type, the average atheist position is a defensible position that is totally fair and doesn't require critiquing. So it's interesting that there's a lot left of the video. I can't wait to see what kind of atheist we're going to be arguing against, because it sounds like me and Alex might be on the same team, which would be fascinating.
What I'm actually addressing today is something a bit more ambitious. Today, we're tackling philosophical materialism, which holds that physical matter and energy operating under natural laws is the complete and sufficient explanation for everything that exists, like the universe itself, the life in it, the consciousness observing it, and the religious traditions that have appeared in every human civilization, without exception, across all of recorded history. Now, that's kind of a lot to account for. The actual evidentiary standard that atheists most consistently apply to religious claims is the one that Carl Sagan articulated, saying extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence.
We're even both quoting Carl Sagan in our opening sections. I like Alex. I think me and Alex might get on. My only complaint, from an atheist perspective, is that this is being framed, both in the title, the opening, and all of his discussions so far, and what he's just done, as atheists' views. This very specific philosophical materialism that he is tackling, Alex is equating with atheism. Whereas, as I've now said a couple of times, the mainstream atheist is an agnostic atheist, as he has just described. We all agree that it's a pointless conversation to have with a religious person about whether or not you can prove there isn't a God, right? We all understand the burden of proof, and so we say fine, but I don't believe in any of the gods that have been claimed throughout history and across the world, because there is no evidence for them. And there are zero rational reasons to believe in any of those. That is the mainstream atheist. If Alex has a problem with philosophical materialism, which I have to apologise is not something I know very much about, but it seems like Alex is being quite thorough in his explanations, so hopefully we'll be alright. It sounds like from his description that the people that all believe in that theory are atheist, but that does not mean that all atheists have that same view of the world. And so equating the two, I think, is unfair. I think that's deliberately misleading. So I would like him to retitle the video, please. Also because it seems like this is nothing to do with history, but I guess we'll find out. And I would like him to reframe and stop referring to his opponent in this, faux debate as atheists, because that seems unreasonable.
That standard follows from a basic probabilistic reasoning, which is that the more a claim departs from what background knowledge would lead us to expect, the more evidence is now required. So, the real question is whether it's being applied consistently, because the claim that a finely tuned universe containing conscious beings who independently produced identical theological frameworks across every continent...
Identical theological frameworks? Is he claiming that the different religions that have occurred across different continents, I don't know what specifically, the different religions from different continents, have the same theological framework? Because that is not correct. This might be a classic, and there's some great videos on my channel that you can check out to refute this idea. I'll put one here because I can't think of what they're titled off the top of my head. I've done a lot of videos. Okay. This might just be a classic religious gotcha, which falls apart as soon as you start actually learning and studying history. Oh, maybe this is the history problem. The idea that there are similarities between so many ancient theological stories, and so many similarities between one religion and another, that there must have been a true origin, which is bollocks. The ones that are the most closely related are clearly influenced by each other. The Bible, the Hebrew Bible, very clearly references and uses the Epic of Gilgamesh, and so on and so forth. Again, great video on that on my channel if you want to learn a little bit more. But this idea that religions have independently come up with the exact same theological, foundations is crazy. Excluding direct influences and then the existence of coincidence, because religious people especially, but also people with any kind of fascination in the supernatural, like to pretend that coincidence isn't a thing that can exist. Sometimes there are coincidences. And that doesn't mean you have psychic powers or that God is real. It means that the world is very big, and sometimes there is a coincidence.
Guiding intelligence is about as extraordinary a claim as human thought has ever produced. It makes the claim God exists look pretty modest by comparison. Now, part of what makes this conversation frustrating is that the new atheist movement spent 2 decades conflating the deliverances of empirical science with the conclusions of philosophical materialism, acting like because science explains how things work, materialism is therefore true.
Call me stupid, I need to look up materialism just definitionally to understand exactly what he's trying to say here. Okay, so philosophical materialism is the idea that their physical reality is all there is, and that thoughts are physical processes, rejecting the idea of souls, ghosts, gods. So probably, if I dug in and looked into it more, I might wind up being a philosophical materialist, because I certainly reject the idea of ghosts and souls, and I do believe that we have a very warped idea of the mind and the body as separate things, and that actually we are the processes that occur in here, which is evidenced by every instance of somebody suffering from a brain injury and their personality and personhood changing. So maybe, actually, I would be the atheist philosophical materialist that Alex would argue against. I just haven't read anything about it, so I wouldn't make a claim for that position.
Science studies the physical world, but materialism is the claim that the physical world is all there is. So that second claim needs its own evidence, which means that the confidence the new atheist movement borrows from science doesn't really belong there.
Again, I still think, even though maybe as he's describing it, maybe the new atheist movement is largely also subscribes to this idea of philosophical materialism, I still think it's not best to conflate those things.
They're just using science's credibility to prop up a philosophical position that science doesn't actually establish. Because I think it's important, let's name those 2 tactics. The first is known as definitional retreat, where they redefine atheism as merely the absence of belief to escape the burden of proof.
If philosophical materialism is its own viewpoint, its own theory, why would atheists need to hide behind that and redefine atheism? Why wouldn't they just say, well, I'm a philosophical materialist?
Still arguing that consciousness is just neural complexity, that religion evolved from fear and ignorance, and that the universe arose through natural processes.
And control. Control, looking for explanations, and our natural predisposition to superstition are actually probably, in my view, bigger factors than ignorance and fear. Although those are certainly used for the purposes of control. I prayed to the rain god yesterday, and it rained today, so clearly there is a rain god. And that's nothing to do with fear, it is to do with ignorance partly, which is why we don't believe that there's a rain god anymore, because now we know how rain works. But some people, many, many millions of people, are still clinging on regardless. Clinging on for life.
Again, those are substantive positive claims. You don't get to use the minimal definition to escape the burden and then argue the full metaphysical position. That's not consistent.
Yeah, and that's, if you are claiming to be an atheist who is a philosophical materialist, then that's fair. But being like, well, no, actually all atheists are philosophical materialists, not only contradicts with what he already said earlier, but isn't fair, and this is quite bizarre start.
And the second move is known as Russell's teapot. In this specific context, it's the idea that theism bears the entire burden of proof because nobody's proved a teapot orbits the sun. Basically, it's shifting the burden of proof away from the person making the
I've never heard Russell's teapot explained exactly like that, but okay.
Claim to begin with. But what these moves actually establish is a little narrower, meaning that you aren't required to believe a claim with no supporting evidence. Now, whether the theist position is in that category or not is exactly what this episode addresses.
Great.
So, doesn't science explain where the universe came from, and what does physics actually say? The fine-tuning argument was one of the first things that started shifting the framework for me, and not just because someone made a persuasive case, but because I looked at the numbers directly. But don't take my word for it. Roger Penrose, the mathematician and physicist from Oxford, and not a religious man, actually calculated the probability of the universe arriving at its current low-entropy initial state by chance. The real figure that he came up with is 10 raised to the power of 10 raised to the power of 123.
Some of you will be familiar with the fine-tuning argument, and so I apologise, you can skip ahead if you want. I will just give a little overview for those of you who aren't, and let me just look up quickly how... So it looks like Roger Penrose came up with the Penrose number by looking at the phase space map, which is every possible physical state of a system that occupies this map in statistical mechanics. So he estimated the total phase space volume of all possible universe configurations, and then compared that with the number of ordered life-permitting universes like we observe that we have. Essentially what that means in the simplest form is that the existence of the universe depends on a number of physical constants, like the strength of gravity and the charge of an electron, etc. The problem with the fine-tuning argument is that the real statistical likelihood of our universe existing is 1 in 1, because it does exist. We have no other universes to test against. There is no baseline comparison. This is something known as the anthropic principle. It's essentially survivor bias. We're viewing the universe through the lens of being in a survivable universe. We necessarily observe a life-sustaining universe, because if we didn't live in a life-sustaining universe, we would not be there to observe it. I hope I'm explaining this okay, because it makes sense in my head. It's basically the same thing as I said earlier. Our chances of existing and being in this universe are 1 in 1, because we do exist and we can observe it. And therefore, making comparisons to other universe setups is something that we can't do. And it's an important fact to consider that Alex has mentioned, that Roger Penrose was not a religious man. He was not making a religious claim. He was not saying, you see, there's such a small chance that there would be a life-sustaining universe that therefore God must have done it. He's saying, we need a better understanding of the fundamental physics. There's nothing about the fine-tuning argument that necessitates a God. There's nothing about it that gives evidence for a God. It's a pointless statistic, it's a pointless comparison, because there's nothing to compare it to. Similarly, there are people that believe in the infinite multiverse theory, in which case us being one of the life-sustaining universes amongst infinite universes would be, again, the likelihood would be 1 in 1 if there were infinite universes. Oh, it's called retrospective certainty. This idea that I was just explaining, that the chances of the universe existing are 1 in 1 because we exist to observe it, and therefore, of course there are. These numbers are irrelevant. The chance is 100% of a life-sustaining universe existing, and there's nothing about any of that that requires a God.
The real issue isn't just that the initial state was improbable, because random events can absolutely be improbable. The issue is that it was improbable in the specific direction required to produce a universe capable of containing complexity, chemistry, and observers.
But again, as I have just explained, if it was not capable of containing observers, we simply wouldn't be here to observe it.
Improbable state could point anywhere, but a state calibrated to permit life points towards something.
No, it doesn't. It's interesting that there has been such an emphasis on the burden of proof, because that is a claim that has a burden of proof. Alex has just made an assumption with no evidence backing it. Number big is not evidence for God, especially when he's just explained that statistically random events can happen.
The inference from specified improbability to design isn't actually a religious move. It's the standard methodology of forensic science, archaeology, and SETI research. For example, when we find an arrowhead, we infer design, not because stones can't chip by accident, but because the chipping on the stone fell in precisely the pattern required to produce a functional tool.
He's right in that it's not just statistically unlikely for an arrowhead to have formed, although arrow-like shapes probably have formed plenty of times. It's that we know how an arrowhead could be made to look like that. This is just teetering on the edge of an intelligent design argument, so let's see where it goes.
The exact same reasoning applies to a universe whose initial conditions fell in precisely the pattern required to produce stars, planets, chemistry, and observers.
No, it doesn't. And that's exactly why I made the point I just made. We know that people did and do make arrowheads, okay? We have a historical precedent for that. We know how they can have done it. We know why they would have done it. There is no notion of how, why, or whom would have created the universe by putting those conditions in place. They are not comparable things. An arrowhead, a human-made arrowhead, and the conditions necessary for a low-entropy start to the universe are completely incomparable things. That's ridiculous.
Now, the standard materialist response is a shifting of the goalpost that ends up in the multiverse, which is described as an infinite number of universes with varying constants.
That can be an explanation. I don't think there's enough evidence to believe in a multiverse theory either, personally. I think there's much simpler explanations to challenge what he has just claimed.
We happen to inhabit the one compatible with life. This theory proposes an infinite number of unobservable, untestable entities.
Well, using the Penrose statistic creates the same problem. We don't have any observable comparisons.
Conclusion that this universe was designed. By the standard that atheists apply to religious claims that it's unfalsifiable, unobservable, and requiring belief in entities beyond detection, the multiverse itself is a faith claim.
I don't know if I would say multiverse theory is a faith argument, but again, that is partially why I don't really hold to the multiverse theory. It doesn't have anything to do with atheism. Multiverse theory, you don't have to believe in a multiverse, an infinite multiverse, to be an atheist, and I don't.
Fred Hoyle, an astronomer who was committed atheist, looked at the carbon resonance that makes life chemistry possible and wrote that the universe looks like a super intellect has monkeyed with physics. Now, he never became a theist. He just followed the math and said what it showed.
This just highlights, I think, a difference in perspectives. Alex has specifically chosen secular studies, secular scientists and physicists and things for this video. Isn't there something in the fact that these highly intelligent people who have probed into these deeper philosophical, mathematical, origin of the universe questions and have not come out theist? Because Alex is sort of arguing that you should, whereas the people whose studies that he is citing for this purpose never did. It didn't change their mind on theism at all. Doesn't that kind of a little bit suggest there's no correlation between these statistics and being theist and evidence for God? It's just interesting.
There's a second main feature of the physical world that materialism has an even harder time with. One that doesn't involve telescopes or particle accelerators.
Tell me.
Every moment of your personal experience of being alive. So, what about consciousness? Doesn't neuroscience explain the mind?
No, nowhere near. We haven't even fully mapped out the brain yet. It's incredibly complex, the idea of consciousness. But the way he's just framed the question, hasn't neuroscience explained consciousness? And he's obviously going to say, no, it hasn't. That would be a God of the Gaps argument. Let's see. Hi folks, Editing Emma here. Thanks to Alex's video, I have genuinely discovered a fascination with and started reading about theories of consciousness. Thank you, Alex, for inspiring my latest hyperfixation, including, spoiler alert, as I will mention later in the video, Daniel Dennett's Consciousness Explained. And this is kind of a small thing, but I just couldn't let this part go with the way that Alex is talking about materialism here as though it is kind of a problematic fringe atheist thing. Whereas in reality, materialism is by far the mainstream viewpoint, especially compared with its opposing view, which Alex holds and weirdly hasn't named. Also in hindsight, kind of suspicious, which is dualism. Pretty simple, dualism to mind and body as separate things. That is much more of a religious view, the idea of spirit and vessel. Maybe Alex genuinely has misunderstood that as more mainstream because he is a religious person, probably surrounded by religious people who hold a dualist view. But among philosophers, neuroscientists, the actual experts who attempt to study consciousness, materialism is by far the preferred viewpoint. I think Alex is being, probably unintentionally, a little bit misleading here, and I couldn't let that go. So thanks, enjoy the rest of the video, bye!
While neuroscience explains which brain regions activate during which tasks and how chemistry affects cognition, what it hasn't explained, and what the most serious secular philosophers of mind acknowledge it hasn't explained, is why any of that physical activity produces subjective experience at all. David Chalmers, a philosopher at NYU, and not religious, named this the hard problem of consciousness. The easy problems are things like explaining how the brain integrates information, but the hard problem asks why the mind perceives itself to be, or on a smaller scale, why pain doesn't just trigger avoidance behavior, but it actually hurts. Just imagine a being physically identical to you in every measurable way, but with no inner experience, no soul, so to speak. They respond to pain in the same way that you do, but nothing is happening on the inside. Philosophers call this being a philosophical zombie, and the question that materialism can't answer is why we aren't those.
But what counter is there to this that isn't a God of the Gaps theory? Oh, this is something that we don't understand yet about the human mind and body. What is there here other than God of the Gaps?
Now, Thomas Nagel, a philosopher from NYU and an atheist, wrote an entire book arguing that materialism cannot account for consciousness and that the field has not ever solved this problem.
And that's cool, Alex, and I'm finding this really interesting. But I ask you again, who cares? What does that matter? How does that relate to the problem that we're talking about? What does it matter to the atheist that we do not have an answer to the problem, the question of consciousness? Again, nothing about that necessitates a god.
So, what does the actual historical and archaeological record show about the origins of religion? Well, the materialist account of religious origins goes like this. Early humans, frightened by phenomenon that they couldn't explain, invented gods to manage their anxiety.
Not necessarily frightened. Again, the correct framing of this, I think, is superstition rather than fear. Fear imposes obviously an emotional element to this that I think is unhelpful.
The most significant problem to me is a site known as Göbekli Tepe. This is an archaeological site in southeastern Turkey excavated beginning in 1994 by Klaus Schmidt. What Schmidt found was a complex of massive carved stone pillars, some weighing 20 tons, built approximately 11,600 years ago. That date predates writing by 6,000 years. It predates agriculture, and it predates every settled civilization in the record. But what it does not predate is religion. By the assessment of its excavator and the majority of scholars who have studied it, Göbekli Tepe is a ritual site. It's a temple complex. The people who built it hadn't figured out farming yet, that we know of, but they had an organized, large-scale cooperative labor around something that wasn't materialistically practical. So, if religion is a coping mechanism for what primitive minds couldn't understand, it should appear after agriculture and cities.
Why? Okay, you can call me an idiot if I'm fundamentally misunderstanding this, but why would religion as an answer to superstitious behavior and questions, why would that need to predate agriculture?
But instead it appears first. So, the most ancient deliberate human construction that we have is not a granary, it's a full-blown temple. The materialist story has primitive people inventing God because they were scared of thunder, but the archaeological record has them building religious sites before they figured out bread.
I don't even understand how those things correlate. They could have been scared of thunder. In fact, they most likely would have been scared of thunder before they figured out bread. There was thunder before there was bread, I'm pretty sure.
That's the real chronological problem, and
Why?
Jacques Calvin takes it further with a causal argument. In The Birth of the Gods and the Origins of Agriculture, he argued that the symbolic and religious revolution didn't just precede the agricultural one, it actually drove it. The shift towards sacred symbolism structured the kind of cooperative, purposeful cognition that made organized civilization possible in the first place. On Calvin's account, religion isn't filling a gap left by ignorance. It's the actual cognitive foundation that made knowledge-seeking civilization possible at all.
Oh, so one of the fundamentally important parts of this argument that Alex did not mention, part of why I'm confused, Göbekli Tepe, sorry if that's a horrific pronunciation, is considered the site where agriculture began. It sits within what's called the Golden Triangle, where wild wheat, barley, and other founder crops originated, but its builders were not farmers. Hence the importance of this site for this argument. The fact that Alex just didn't think to mention that, it's okay, because we looked it up and now we understand a little better. I feel like he was trying to make me feel like an idiot. Suppose this is all completely true, and Jacques Calvin is completely right, and that it was religion and religious worship that drove the move towards agriculture and bigger communal projects. What would that prove other than religion existed earlier than some people thought? That doesn't prove that the religions are true, or that there's a creator, or anything remotely like that.
What appears that the mind is reliably generating across every ancient culture and period leads directly to the next question. What is converging across ancient traditions, and what does that force the materialist to explain? Now, I've covered the ancient convergence in detail on this channel before, so I'll keep it tight and just use it as evidence in a different argument rather than retell the whole story.
There's a video about shared theological stories on my channel debunking this exact claim, which you can check out if you want to.
The question I'm putting to the materialist account here is simple. What's your explanation for this? Because the options are pretty limited. But before laying out what converges, I'm going to address a predictable objection. That cross-cultural comparison is just cherry-picking, and that you can find surface similarities between anything if you look hard enough. But the answer is that the scholars doing this work, like Mircea Eliade at the University of Chicago, Walter Burkert at the University of Zurich, Michael Heiser at the University of Wisconsin, and Jan Osman at the University of Constance, are not LDS apologists. They are all comparative religion scholars and archaeologists working within their own fields, and the convergence that they document is at the structural level, not the surface level like the critique requires.
Okay, so we won't use that critique. That's not the critique that I was using anyway. Get to the question, my friend. My camera's running out of recording space.
So, when you map religious traditions across every inhabited continent before any of them had documented contact with each other, the same structural elements appear independently. By structural, I mean the specific organizational form matches, and not just a general concept, but a particular arrangement of who, what, and how. Like a divine council, which is a heavenly assembly presiding under a chief deity. This appears in the Ugaritic text, the Mesopotamian epics, the original Hebrew text before it was edited, the Vedic tradition, the Greek Olympian structure, and the Aztec pantheon, to name a few.
Okay, let's start there then. I think it's interesting and just worth pointing out that one of the first things that comes up when you search for this area of study is Brigham Young University, which is obviously a Mormon institute. Brigham Young was one of the founders of the LDS. I guess it probably wasn't called LDS back then, but... So this is clearly a popular Mormon talking point, and we can understand probably where Alex has found it then. Trying to find a source that isn't Mormon. So as far as I can tell, the main problem with this idea, specifically regarding the divine council as like a theological convergence, is that the idea of a council and a hierarchy at the head of a civilization existed in those human civilizations, which is what the story was then based on. I don't see anything, again, that requires a god or a joined theological origin here. It's just that hierarchy existed in the human communities, and so they wrote about hierarchies. So they wrote about hierarchies within their religion. There's nothing crazy about that to me that, like, defies what we believe about the world and means that God must be real. Okay, brother, what's next?
And a cosmic flood with a specific sequential structure, like the divine decision to enact the flood, the chosen survivor, the vessel, the storm, the mountain landing, the bird release, and the covenant, which appears in Mesopotamian, Hebrew, Greek, Hindu, Mayan, and Australian traditions with no documented contact.
Again, I have a great video with an actual expert explaining this in much more detail, but the long and short of it is ancient Israelites were most likely aware of the Mesopotamian flood myth. That is most likely, because of course we can't state for sure, that is most likely a direct influence. That's the reason that those converge in that way. Merchants and scribes did move across borders. The idea that the ancient world was completely isolated is not true. Not only that, but it's incorrect to assume that the earliest writing we have is the earliest origin of a particular story. Certainly these stories came from oral traditions that were passed around before they were written down. And to keep it simple, but since Alex loves secular scholarship so much, I will just add that scholars widely agree that the Epic of Gilgamesh did in fact influence several parts of the Hebrew Bible, specifically including the flood narrative. Mesopotamian and ancient Israelite communities do share a literary history, they share a language history. They were not completely isolated from each other and these tales just sprung up independently. That is false.
And a sacred ascent ritual with structured passage through levels of heaven involving secret knowledge and sacred names, and appearing in Egyptian mystery traditions, Greek mysteries, Jewish Merkaba mysticism, and Hermetic traditions independently.
The use of the word independently is the issue here. This idea of convergence requires a view of the ancient world that has no collaboration, no crossing of borders. Just because they didn't have freaking jumbo jets back then doesn't mean that scribes and scholars, etc., didn't travel across borders and share stories. They did.
Again, this convergence is structural, not thematic. It's not that different cultures happened to find God meaningful and had some coincidental themes. It's that they actually arrived at the same specific organizational picture of what God and the sacred look like, in detail, seemingly without talking to each other.
Wrong.
And this whole convergence was the second thing that moved me personally.
So again, it sounds like he's read some specifically Mormon philosophical ideas, and that convinced him. Even though if you look at what the widest group of scholars actually agrees is the case, there isn't a case for convergence. Those cultures did exchange writings and ideas. Right, I'm gonna say some shit for a second, because I have thoughts about this, and I've been thinking about this a lot lately. Don't know why. Maybe it's fate. So much of what particularly religious views rely on about the ancient world, it requires you to view the ancient world as so primitive compared with the humans of today. Whereas realistically, we're the same people we were a couple of thousand years ago. Our technology, our science has evolved and changed life dramatically, but we're essentially the same people. People back then had the same curiosity that we do now. There were people just as interested in studying history, studying languages, and meeting other cultures.
So what about DNA and the origin of life? Doesn't biology account for this? Evolution by natural selection is one of the most well-evidenced frameworks in biology, and this episode's theism actually has no conflict with it. The question of whether life evolved is inherently different from the question of whether the process that produced life in the first place is explained by unguided physical processes. To put it simply, evolution starts with living, self-replicating organisms. But how the first one arose from chemistry is a separate and genuinely open problem.
Which can be answered disingenuously by God of the Gaps if you want, as long as you acknowledge that that is not a rational, logic-based explanation for life. Otherwise, yes, Alex, we're in complete agreement on this.
The specific difficulty is that the simplest, self-replicating molecule carries information that isn't just complex, but it's specified. It performs a function. Natural selection explains how functional complexity increases once you have self-replicating organisms because it operates by selection for function. But at the origin of life, there are no organisms yet. There's nothing to select or be selected. The functional information in the first replicating molecule had to arise from chemistry alone, without a selection mechanism, which is exactly the problem. Francis Crick, the co-discoverer of DNA and a committed materialist, found the probability so low that he proposed directed panspermia, saying that life itself was seeded from somewhere else in the universe. But that still doesn't actually solve the problem. It just relocates it.
I've often thought the same thing. Panspermia as an explanation just moves the problem somewhere else. See, I feel like me and Alex would get on. We seem to have quite a lot in common.
So the man who discovered DNA actually thought that the materialist account of its origin was so improbable that ancient aliens looked like a reasonable alternative to him. Antony Flew worked through the philosophical implications of this much more carefully than anyone. Flew was the intellectual backbone of philosophical atheism for 50 years, and in 2004 he actually changed his position to deism specifically because of the specified complexity argument. The claim that the signature of intelligent causation is not just complexity, but complexity organized toward a function. But the really notable thing about Flew isn't where he landed, because deism is still a long way from any specific religious tradition.
True.
It's that after 50 years of building the case for atheism, he followed the evidence past where his prior commitments had wanted him to go.
Well, yes, but if you're going to make that argument, Alex, then I have to reference something I said earlier, which is all of the scholars that you referenced earlier who are not religious, who did not change their position based on the evidence that they discovered. So this is meaningless. You can't use that argument when the opposite is also the case in the evidence you've presented. It doesn't really mean anything in the grand scheme of things to say, well, this one expert in their field changed their mind based on the evidence to become a deist. After presenting all of these scholars who did not change their minds and were still non-religious following the evidence. All you're doing is arguing against yourself by doing that. My brief search around the internet basically suggests that there are several proposed workarounds to this problem with jump-starting, this intentional selection issue of complexity early on. And there's a few different proposed arguments which a chemist would understand much better than me, so I'm not going to bother trying to explain them to you. You can look them up yourself if you want to. Again, there's nothing about this that requires God. There's nothing about this that evidences God. There's nothing about this even that challenges the concept of materialism. It is just that we don't yet know the answer to this problem. It might not be a problem, or it might be a problem that we can explain. Science hasn't yet done so. To use that as a claim against atheism and for religion is just God of the Gaps again.
To the origin of life and to the ancient human record, the materialist account fails it across every field simultaneously. The multiverse is a faith claim. Abiogenesis resolving itself is also a faith claim. Consciousness turning out to be reducible to neural complexity is, you guessed it, a faith claim. None of those have current evidentiary support. They have hope. And once I recognize that, both positions require faith, like there is no neutral ground where you can stand without making commitments.
Only if your choices are being a member of the Mormon Church, being a member of the Church of Latter-day Saints, or being a philosophical materialist. You could be an agnostic atheist.
The nature of reality, then the question shifted from faith or reason to which account does the available evidence actually support? This episode today isn't claiming to have proved God's existence beyond doubt, because that's not what the evidence permits, and it's just not what's being argued. But across physics, biology, history, archaeology, and philosophy of mind, the evidence is more consistent with the designing intelligence behind the cosmos than with the materialist account of a universe that organized itself from nothing into conscious beings who independently arrived at the same theological picture across every culture on Earth.
First of all, some of that was wrong. As we've discussed, the very last part of that was literally incorrect. And that is all the case, mostly, apart from the bit that was wrong, if you apply the God of the Gaps fallacy. And if you disregard the atheist's ability and the scientist's ability to say, we don't know what started the universe, we don't know exactly how that part of abiogenesis functions, but there's no reason to assume a god did it. Alex is making claims here for atheism. He's falling into a very common religious trap when it comes to talking about atheism, which is forcing a claim upon us, which is that because we don't have an answer to the question of, this specific part of abiogenesis, the complexity, the origin of the complexity of life, whatever, they believe that life originated from nothing and nowhere, which is impossible. Which is a shame. And I think hopefully that's just a poor turning of phrase on his part, or just him not really thinking through this last part very well, because up until now, he has been fairly good at differentiating between materialism and atheism and being slightly more reasonable about what atheism actually is. That last part was complete bullshit, which unfortunately he has used for his conclusion. His conclusion is utter bullshit. It misplaces the burden of proof. It forces assumptions onto atheists that are not true. But he has come to the conclusion, and I know I have at least one Mormon viewer, and you guys can be very lovely, but it is necessary to have, how do I say this in a nice way? It is necessary to have forsaken somewhere along the line, whether by intention or accident, it is necessary to have forsaken logic and rationality in order to come to the conclusion that Mormonism is true. It's just necessary to come to the conclusion that a faith-based view with no evidence is the case. And I don't want that to sound mean, but from a rational perspective, yeah, it's not a logical viewpoint. So it makes sense to me that he would do that. That he would, towards the conclusions that lead to his beliefs, that he would get things wrong, misunderstand or misinterpret things about atheism or materialism, for example. Overall, I liked that. It gave us a lot to talk about. It was very specific. This is the main thing I like about that video that Alex did. It was very specific about what he was talking about. He made sure to say, this is not an argument for God. This is not an argument for deism, which is great, because so many videos like this present this God of the Gaps fallacy and say, you see, therefore God. And Alex didn't do that. He was quite specific not to do that, which I really liked. And he clearly has genuinely read a lot and cited his sources, and I liked that. That was good. He is wrong, though. Obviously, fundamentally, he is wrong. About some specific things in that video, about atheism in a lot of ways, even when contradicting himself about what atheism is, and about Mormonism being true. He is wrong about all those things. But it seems nice. Seems like a cool guy. Thanks so much for watching, everybody. Do make sure you like this video. Leave your thoughts down below, especially if you know shit about science that relates to this video. Make sure you check out today's sponsor using the link down below. Another way to help out this channel and what I do here is by checking out the Patreon. That's patreon.com/EmmaThorneVideos. There will be a longer uncut version of this video on the Patreon if you are interested. With that, I must give a big old shout out and a thank you to my giant chickens and colossal quackers over on Patreon. Especially Conla. Damn it, Conla! importantly, have yourselves a very lovely week, and I will see you really soon.